So the next thing that I want to do to prep the form for submission is to add some additional props to the button component that we are rendering in our app component. So as a quick reminder, this is a separate component. This is not a regular HTML button. However, I would like for this component to be able to support the same type of attributes that we are used to using on regular buttons. For example, in a typical form, if we had a regular HTML button here, we could add something like the type attribute set to submit. And in React, we could also add something like an onClick handler and provide that function to run on user click. We could totally do this if this was a regular button like so, right? But we don't have a button element, we have a button component. So the way that we can emulate the functionality of a regular button is to take these props and define them in our actual button component and treat them just as we normally would if this was a regular HTML button. Remember, the reason why we defined the button component in the first place is to enable an abstraction of some of the commonalities, such as the common CSS classes, to its own separate reusable button component. So in order to support an API like this, I'm going to open up my button class, my button component, and let me drag it over here to the right-hand side. And of course, what I want to do is set up the support for those two types of props, onClick and type. So beginning here, where we are destructuring our existing children and class name props, let's assume that we're now going to receive an onClick prop and a type prop. And all we have to do is pass these props down to this regular HTML button that we are rendering right here. So right here, I'm going to assume my button component is going to receive an onClick prop that's going to be a function. So I'm going to define onClick on this button and pass in whatever is the onClick prop, whatever is the function that the parent component rendering this component gives me. And similarly, I'm going to provide a type attribute right here and make it equal to the type prop. So whatever the parent component that renders this button gives me, that's what I'm going to render or pass along rather to this button HTML element. So now this syntax right here is going to be totally valid. All right, I'm going to remove it for now, but we'll come back to it later because now our button supports this API. So that's generally a very common goal when you're building React components that are basically wrappers over existing HTML elements. Like this button component is really just a single HTML button. But now we can keep the things that we care about that are common, such as CSS classes, while still allowing the parent to customize certain elements, such as what to do on click, such as the children to render. We're trying to maintain a very similar API or design to a regular HTML button, but we're now kind of adding our own little flares and things to this button component to distinguish it. All right, so keeping in the tradition of defining our prop types for our props, I want to add our two new props here of onClick and type, and I'm going to make them both optional. So right here, I'm going to add onClick, and here I'm going to say prop types.func. So we're going to tell prop types whenever it's performing runtime type validation in the browser that when the parent passes me an onClick prop, it should be a function. And then on the line below, I will expect another prop called type. That's also going to be optional, but I'm going to tell prop types that it should check that if it is passed, it should be a string. And for these two props, onClick and type, that I have not made required, one thing that I'd like to do is define their default values. So fallback values to utilize in this component if the parent does not provide me those props. So as a reminder, the way that we could do that is we can define another property on our component class, and that is default props. We set default props equal to an object. The property keys are going to be the props themselves, and the values are going to be the default values to fall back to in case the parent does not give me one. So for example, I could say for type, if the parent does not give me that prop, then provide the type prop with a value of button. So this will be the value of the type prop, but only if the parent does not give me the type prop. Similarly, for something like onClick, I can say that if the parent component renders a button component and does not give me a value for the onClick prop, I can make this something basic like an empty arrow function that does nothing. So now, for example, here we are rendering button in the app component. We are passing in neither the onClick prop nor the type prop. So we are going to fall back to these approaches right here, these fallback values. and thus we're going to have something to give to this onClick and this type attribute right here as well. Then when we decide to add those props right here to this rendered button, we're going to override the defaults by passing in the actual values that we want. And we'll get to that in a lesson or two from now. All right, so that's all there is to cover in this lesson. In this lesson, we added 2 more props to our button component. Those 2 props are the onClick function and the type string. And we're doing this so that we can render our button component just like a regular HTML button in the parent, but maintain a very similar functionality, very similar API. If we had a regular HTML button, we could very easily add an onClick handler to it like so. We can't do that to our button right here because it is a React component. But what we can do is follow a very similar design where we pass an onClick prop to our button component, and inside our button component, we take that onClick prop, we take that function or method that our parent component gives us, and we simply pass it down or delegate it down to the actual HTML button that we are returning here as JSX, which does support this onClick syntax. So we're kind of passing it an additional layer down, an additional level deep, and that allows us to keep the original design of an HTML button while also keeping things that we want in this component, such as, for example, these starter classes that style the button. All right, so keeping some things constant and keeping some things dynamic and open to change, that is the entire purpose of components. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.